at ya, at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya, coming at ya. Rhyme style disaster, coming at ya, at ya. Tell you what's master.
All right, welcome to another episode of Cut the Bull. I am Wilfred Reilly, as most of you know by this point. Excuse my scruffy appearance. I just left the gym, one of two I've been to today. I'm here today with my talented and lovely co-host, Christy Kelly, and as I always note, Brooks Crenshaw, also a lovely individual. And today we're talking to Russell Warne, among a number of other serious texts. Russell, good to see you.
Nice to see you too.
So, all right. I mean, in general, the format's pretty free flowing. I'm gonna open with a question, then we're gonna move around the panel. And the first question, I guess, for a smart but lay audience, what is IQ? I mean, you say you're debunking 35 myths about IQ and knowledge, if I have the number correct. What is IQ? What does it mean to say someone is smart?
Well, yeah, you're mentioning the subtitle of a book I wrote in the Know Debunking 35 Myths About Human Intelligence. And yes, the letters IQ show up a lot in that book. IQ used to stand for intelligence quotient and now doesn't stand for anything at all, because we don't use a quotient anymore. But it's basically a score that measures a person's general intelligence. These scores are calibrated so that 100 is the average for the population, and that a little over two-thirds of people are between 115, sorry, excuse me, 85 and 115, and then about 95% of people are between 70 and 130. So most folks like you and me are going to be hanging around in the 100 area. Other people will be further out, but it's just a measure to be able to globalize and summarize someone's intelligence level with one number.
Yeah, and that's presented in standard deviation form, right? So it's not a ratio like you would be an 85 if you are one standard deviation in terms of questions answered correctly behind the fellow who's 100.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it used to be a quotient, isn't anymore. It used to be based on age, which when you think about it for about 2 seconds doesn't work very well for adults. It used to be, if a child was 8 years old and they scored as well as the average 10-year-old. Okay, 10 divided by 8 is 1.25. Let's multiply by 100, get rid of a decimal. Oh, that child has an IQ of 125. That doesn't work very well for adults. If you're 40 and you're doing as well as the average 45-year-old, and so we base on standard deviations. That's why I could say, oh, a little over two-thirds are between that number and that number, because that's one standard deviation around the average of 100.
Fair enough. And I guess I'd toss out another kind of slow moving ball here, and then we're probably going to move to Christy and Brooks. But so in terms of why you would write this book, is there a great deal of misinformation about IQ that currently exists? Or
Oh yeah.
intelligence in general, the human mind? And I think I know the answer, but
Yeah, and I appreciate starting me off with the softballs. That's helpful to ease me into this. Yeah, there are a lot of misconceptions. Some of them, there's a kernel of truth to them. Um, a good example, one of the myths I address in there is the idea that the content on these tests is really trivial and that can't possibly measure intelligence. And honestly, some of them do look like simple puzzles or trivia questions. And there's a kernel of truth to some of them. And the reality is that we can still use questions like that to measure people's reasoning. But some of the misconceptions come from within psychology, and from other psychologists who are not very well informed or seize on a half truth and blow it up. And then some of them come from outside the field, from society at large, for a variety of reasons. Um, I think most of the misconceptions do come from a kernel of truth. And so in the book, in each chapter, I talk about, okay, where is this coming from? Why, yes, this content does look trivial, but here's why the conclusion you're drawing from that doesn't work. And I hope it's done some good. It's gotten a great reception over the past couple of years the book's been out. And so, yeah, I will see if in 5 years whether the publisher thinks it's not needed anymore and discontinues the book. Oh, you've done your job. Everyone has this all cleared up. No more book. Okay, fine.
Well, fair enough. I don't know if that's I don't know if the questions about the human mind and society will have been cleared up, but I do know publishers often make financial decisions about whether they're gonna rerun a text. Christy Kelly, what do you think? Are you a test skeptic? Do you feel that I mean, we've all looked at the book before this. What are your thoughts, I guess, just in general?
I guess I just had like a burning question. Again, I invoked my children often because I'm a mother, right? So I was in California for most of my life, and in California, they do not do the IQ test for Black children because they say it's racist. So if you're Black, they cannot IQ test you, which I was like, okay, whatever, it's California. So we moved to Mississippi, and strangely enough, in Mississippi, when my two girls, and I won't say which one, got the IQ test, there is one that I just, you objectively know which is the smarter kid. She did not score higher than her sister. Matter of fact, she scored significantly lower. Now, I would assume, I mean, Will likes to brag about his IQ test, right? That he is high. He does. Does it all the time. Everybody knows without even Will mentioning his IQ that he has a high IQ. Just
I don't
the
think
way he
I've ever
talks.
in my life, just to clarify, been like playing pickup ball or talking to friends and said, I have a really high IQ.
There
I
You've
was
mean,
a
I'm
said
recent
it.
there was a
arrogant, but
recent
that's
tweet.
not what I would lead with.
You've said it
Uh,
on the show a couple times, but it's
really?
fine. We know
I have
Will
to
is
look that up.
brilliant. Yes, Will is
He,
brilliant.
he has he
But
has
can
to
you,
brag. Hey, I can bench more than my IQ. Can you?
but do you think California
I'm
is
not sure I
right
can
that
actually.
they should that they should have stopped IQing, doing the IQ test for Black children? And how can you explain the objectively how one kid who you would think would be smarter would not score as well as their sibling?
That's a great two-pronged question. Let's start with the California piece. That policy came out of a lawsuit in the 1970s called Larry P. versus, I think it was Riles, but everyone calls it the Larry P. case. Um, Children at the time, and this was common not just in California, but nationwide, if they scored low on these tests, were placed in classes that were almost always completely separate all the entire school day, called the educably mentally retarded classes. We would today call these special education, non-mainstream. We have better lingo today, better euphemisms today. And disproportionately, the African American students were scoring low enough to be placed in those classes, and so there was a class action suit that made it to the California Supreme Court, and the court ruled that it was discriminatory to use the test against African American students. Now, you're right. They still could use it for other students, Hispanic, white, Asia, whatever, but for these groups, no. Um, Without getting to the weeds about the court case and about how to settle scientific issues in the public sphere, um, that case, while it did reduce the number of children placed in these educably mentally retarded classes, um, in the long run had some downsides. And actually, you had in later years California parents suing so that their African American child could be tested because they felt like, because we can't use the test on this child, my child's needs aren't being identified and met. So I don't like blanket bans completely for any test assessment measure because just saying, oh, if you belong to Group X, we can't do this for you. It ends up creating just as many problems as it solves. The judge in that case did later lift his injunction order, but the state of California, just on its own, has said no more for African American students. And then I've heard that they have since expanded it to other kids. So that's where it is. I don't. I mean, I'm not. I wasn't a lawyer in the 70s, so I really don't know how much of a place I can say, oh, they made a mistake. But I will say that systematically banning these tests against one class or another, I feel like doesn't solve the inherent problems. We can have a legitimate argument about whether the assessment process for what was then called EMR classes, today's special ed or other courses, whether it's fair, whether it's legitimate, whether the demographics are evidence of some sort of unfairness. I'm completely open to that conversation. And I think that's a much more conversation than let's ban the test for group X, let's ban the test for group Y. As far as siblings go, I know what you mean. I have four children of my own, and it's really hard to be a parent of more than one without starting to make comparisons. Even if it's just something as innocent as, why are you a pickier eater than your brother? So I get that. Without knowing them specifically, I can't say, but we do know that there are sometimes differences. It's an average of about 10 to 12 points, 9 to 12 points within families on average. Children, and any parent will tell you this, it's surprising how different siblings are sometimes. But I can't say specifically why a parent's judgment about child A and child B, the test didn't line up.
I I think my bigger question was, I think I was watching an interview with you and you said, some people are like, "Oh, I'm just a bad test taker." And you seem to dismiss that as an excuse for getting a low IQ.
Mhm.
But I'm wondering, does that kind of prove that, okay, maybe this child really is a bad test taker?
There is a legitimate test anxiety. That's real, where people do underperform because of an anxiety disorder, because of a threatening context. We see this a lot with young children, where they don't know the school psychologists and they're nervous because they think they're in trouble and they don't do well, and this psychologist doesn't often relax them. But setting aside test anxiety, setting aside anxiety disorders, there doesn't seem to be a unique poor test taking construct in people's minds. Um, and so, that being said, these tests aren't perfect, and the test creators like myself don't pretend that they are. Everyone acknowledges what we call the standard error of measurement. Laymen call it the margin of error. Um, for intelligence tests, it's about, depending on some characteristics, 2.5 to 5 points, plus or minus. And I do recognize, especially, I don't know how old your children were, but below the age of about 10, IQ is really unstable anyway. And I would say
Mm.
that even if at the moment the margin of error might only be 3, 4 points or whatever, I don't trust IQ in children before about age 10, give or take. And so that might be another thing, is that these scores are still fluctuating in childhood.
Okay. I think that's a good fair summary. Brooks Crenshaw, what do you think about IQ?
Yes, sir.
Or any of the specific chapters in the book we've talked about, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, one of the questions that I have for you, Russell, is, and I think you cover this with regard to different types, but I wanted you to address kind of the more modern, fashionable notions of emotional intelligence and SEL, social emotional learning. What your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, the idea of emotional intelligence is that there's some sort of ability of understanding your own emotions, dealing with them, and then also perceiving other people's emotions and helping dealing with those in social settings, which you have to admit is a very useful skill, especially if you do a job in sales or if you want to be a politician. Um, I feel sorry for the emotional intelligence psychologists. They were building this idea in the 90s, and then a New York Times journalist wrote a book about emotional intelligence that went far beyond their evidence and their claims, and it was a huge bestseller. And then the psychologist had to pick up the pieces when inevitably the backlash came, and it didn't, the EQ didn't end up mattering as much as people thought. And I feel like they're now reaching good equilibrium where some of the evidence is catching up. Um, my opinion is that most of what we're seeing in emotional intelligence is a mix of some cognition, um, and then also a mix of personality traits, and maybe a little bit of something's unique. It seems to be more of an amalgamation of of these psychological traits. Um,
If I can jump in there briefly, are you saying that EQ is basically just IQ and personality?
I'd say it's mostly, if not entirely, that. I am not quite ready to say, throw it all out. But
Okay.
when people do these studies, we call them divergent validity studies. How much does this test score diverge from that test score if they're supposed to measure different things? Um, there's a stronger connection between conscientiousness and agreeableness from the personality side with emotional intelligence than was originally theorized. And to these psychologists' credit, they are modifying their theories in the light of new evidence. And then there's a little bit of cognition in there too. And so I'm not quite ready to say, oh yeah, it's just personality plus IQ. Who cares? I'm still just enough evidence for me to say, okay, there might be something new mixed in with personality, mostly, and a little bit of cognition. Um,
So
so
to
yeah.
clarify, you're saying that high agreeableness and high conscientiousness
Mhm.
with some IQ is kind of that profile.
I would say it's 60 to I want to say 80%. Yeah. Maybe 20 to 40% something unique plus, some measurement error and another randomness that creeps in. Um, Other psychologists will disagree, but no one seems to disagree that, okay, there are at least correlations with the personality and the cognition piece, but we can disagree about what those mean. I think it means there's some redundancy, and I'm willing to have that discussion, and figure out, okay, how much is legitimate redundancy, how much is overlap, how much is two abilities relating to the same outcome. It gets messy in psychology, which is one of the reasons I love it.
And do you have a take on SEL?
I'm not an expert on social emotional learning. A lot of it ends up looking a little bit like therapy when it's implemented into schools.
Mhm.
And there's some good evidence that trying to teach therapeutic techniques to people who don't have mental health problems and having them taught by people who are not mental health experts might be doing more harm than good. The idea, though, that, oh, if we teach children emotional self regulation, that will lead to higher math performance or whatever. No, I mean, it sounds really dumb, and like I feel dumb. No, not that, but I feel dumb for saying what I'm about to say. But you want to raise kids' math performance, teach them math. Don't like spend your time getting them in touch with their emotions and but moderation in all things. Kids do need to learn how to share. They do need to learn how to get along with others who are different from them, etc. But the idea that, oh, teaching those will lead to educational benefits has not panned out. And using that social emotional learning, oh, let's teach them emotional regulation the way that someone teaches that to a person with an anxiety disorder in therapy, that seems to be more harmful than good. Um, I went to school in the 90s when it was the self-esteem movement. I think Will, we're roughly the same age from, feel good about yourself and and it turns out, boosting kids' self-esteem didn't boost their achievement. I'm not convinced that boosting things with social emotional learning is any different.
Yeah, actually, a quick response to that before my next question. In my dissertation and my first book, we were actually looking at how people valued their race and other identities. And we had a pretty standard model. We had like linked fate, we had an IQ proxy, and I put in self-esteem in every model just because I thought it would do something. And the panel thought this was kind of amusing, and you could see why, because when you competently adjusted for other things, it had no effect on anything whatsoever. And there's actually kind of a joke in political science. Like, we don't test for big five, you guys do personality traits. But I mean, almost everything, if you look at racial resentment, stereotype threat, neighborhood instability, is going to break down to like one of a few things. Like, one is IQ, one is crime rate.
what are the other? Well, social class, obviously. So I mean that's pretty like privilege, and this is a paper I did at Midwest Politics years ago. Privilege is 75%, I believe, social class. Like if you take one of those
I believe
100
that.
point privilege scales and you ask people their race, their sex, urban, rural, which actually does predict, interestingly, but all of that stuff, and you run Stata and you look at what's significant, it's almost all just social class, like how much money your family earned. So I don't think that surprised anyone on this panel, but it's worth keeping in mind. So for my next question, actually, I mean, this is obviously one of the things people talk about endlessly online regarding IQ. You wrote an article that I'd recommend to people. Stupid, no, unfamiliar, yes. The meaning of low mean IQs in developing nations. And it's a good article. It's somewhat technical. But I mean, the kind of blue text here for the people that are stargazing is a conservative interpretation that I believe can safely be applied is that the scores measure how well a country's citizens have been trained to solve standardized abstract problems on tests. And this comes up because there are all these databases of tested IQs from around the world. Lynn and Van Hanen, probably the best known of these. But I mean, some countries are listed as having a tested IQ of, say, 65. Nepal actually used to bring up the rear with, I think, 42. Now it's all Africa. Gabon at 59. Um,
Guatemala always comes really low in this. And it's like, oh, yeah, I know exactly what databases you mean.
Yeah, they're going. I mean, I understand the test there was done with what when I was in Latin America are called the Ribereño people, who are people that live along like, the bodies of water in the country. But I guess the question would be: everyone knows that there are different IQ gaps between groups. Blacks and
Hmm.
whites, the gap's usually between 10 and 15 points. Asians usually have 5 to 8 points on whites. I mean, this is something we've all talked about professionally and personally. Now, I guess the first, again, kind of easy lead in would be, are there countries that actually have a maximal possible IQ of 60? But more broadly, what causes these gaps? Last comment on these, actually. I pulled this up today when someone sent it to me. It's one of those heterodox sites, I think UN's review. But white IQ in the USA varies between Washington, D.C. at 112. They're scumbags, but they're smart. And West Virginia at 93, up from 92 in my data set. What causes this? Like, first, are there countries that are really down there at 70? And what's the source of these gaps? Genetics, culture, training, in your opinion?
Yeah, let's start with the international talk, because you're right, it gets way more attention than it deserves. Clearly, those scores they correlate with things like GDP, which is, your international version of socioeconomic status. Um, they do correlate with life expectancy and infant mortality and things. Favoritism towards free trade, etc. Um, they're clearly measuring something, and that's why I say in that post on my website you quoted from that, okay, these tests are measuring something. I think it can say they have measured how well these countries have trained people to solve standard abstract problems that appear on tests. Which, when you think about it, is a well, duh answer. What's on the test? Standardized abstract problems. Well, if you do well, you solve a lot of these. But cross-cultural testing is way more complicated and way more messy than people think, especially when you're talking about translation into another language, and especially when you're talking about cultures that are very different, like Western and non-Western, or cultures in developed nations with cultures in economically emerging nations. Um, you said rural, urban, divide in the US. The world urban rural divide is even much more stark. Um, and so people, psychologists mostly, will get a test. Usually it's a matrix test like the Ravens. They say, it's all pictures. All we have to do is translate the instructions. This must work in another country. And it's not that simple. And so yeah, in that link in that post, I have examples of how even just a little bit of westernization makes these people's scores explode as they get exposed to abstract thinking and thinking in terms of general rules rather than surface material they see. Okay, so I I do not think that without establishing certain methodological requirements have to be met, we can say, oh, test performance in Guatemala or in Nigeria or whatever on these matrix tests reflects intelligence. No, we need to establish cultural transferability first. And establishing that is way more complex than you can handle in a podcast. And it will put all of you to sleep before I'm done talking about it. So I'm not going to. But that's why I say in there, okay, look, it's measuring something. What's it measuring? How well these citizens have been taught to solve the types of problems we see on tests. Now, there's some value in that because if you are the president of a country that's trying to enter the post-industrial economy, you need citizens who can think abstractly, who can, deal with generalized problems. That's valuable, but that's not the same as are you smart or not. So when you see, some of these, I don't trust any of them. I definitely don't trust IQs below 75 in those databases. And even then, I get a little nervous in the mid 70s. Even high 70s makes me nervous. But um, I think a lot of it is these tests are not designed for those populations. And I'm wearing the shirt right now. It says Riot. That's the test that I've recently created, the Reasoning and Intelligence Online test. We put a matrix subtest on it. And when we first tried it out, we were finding that if you don't give them practice, even Americans have no idea what to do on these subtests, on these matrix problems. And so that taught me, oh my gosh, you take one of these things to Ghana, where it's even more foreign, of course they're gonna bomb it. That doesn't mean they're dumb, it just means they haven't been trained to solve these types of problems.
If I could ask one question there, wouldn't a very simple test, now obviously there's an issue here with selection, but wouldn't a simple test of how quote unquote smart people are be how people of different backgrounds, if you're talking about immigrants and you've equalized for say study, do in the same country? So like there's a debate about whether West Africans perform better or worse in school than whites. In terms of pure IQ, it seems to be a little worse. It's a 94, I think, in the USA, UK. But in terms of tests like the GCSE, it's a little better. The Nigerians were, I think,
Mhm.
18 points ahead of Brits. So you're seeing roughly similar performance, and that's a Commonwealth immigration country where, I mean,
Yeah.
it's not very selective to get in. Uh, Wouldn't that just logically imply that the huge majority of the gaps we're seeing are this kind of training? Or because you're an expert in this field, is there something I'm not noticing there?
Well, you have hinted at something, and I published an article in about 2015 or so. I thought I was so brilliant discovering that, oh, the gaps are tend to be narrower on educational tests than they tend to be on, the global IQ tests that don't have educational content. And then I discovered later another psychologist pointing this out in the 70s. Um, and that brings up a good point. Gaps are not necessarily interchangeable in the same cause or same test or same population, etc. Different score gaps can have different causes depending on the situation. So you're right, we see smaller gaps on educational tests, especially achievement tests, than we do on some other tests. And that tells us, okay, part of the gap cause is what is the test content? And we see the narrowest gaps on basic end of year achievement tests. So, I have three kids in elementary school right now. Last one will start in the fall, so I will have three this fall. And that end of year like basic math test, do all of you know the minimum to pass third grade? Those gaps tend to be very, very small. Where we see much larger gaps is stuff that is a lot harder to study for, or it's less familiar content. And so that tells us that, okay, how you measure these gaps matters. And then, when you talk about different countries, different populations, you mentioned states earlier, those can have different causes. A good example is states. There does seem to be some geographically clustering. We know that both within countries and between countries, smart people are more likely to voluntarily move. And so, in places where there's a lot more opportunities, like, I think of, for example, DC, Boston, smart people are more likely to gravitate towards there, and they often leave their less intelligent relatives behind, and that can cause some of these gaps. And so, I think when talking about, what causes these gaps, you have to say, well, which gap? Measured how? In which population? Because the causes can vary, and that can either bring you a lot of despair, or if you're like me, it can like, oh, ooh, more research questions. But it is very simplistic to point to this gap and say, look, country A scores lower than country B. That must mean that people who immigrate from country A to country B are doomed to always be less intelligent. You don't know that,
Well, no, you actually
especially.
gave a much more sophisticated answer to the question than I think it required, really. I mean, so yeah, there's some debate about whether, like, even racial and regional group gaps on, say, the NAEP are smaller, they would be on IQ tests. And I'm reasonably familiar with it for someone out of field. But I mean, my question was just sort of like, if Nigerian guys in Britain get a 96 on the whatever the board test used there, wouldn't that probably imply that the average IQ in Nigeria, when it reaches the same level of development, would be about that? I mean, I think that's a reasonable conclusion.
That's a reasonable hypothesis. The thing
Yeah.
I would ask you to remember is what I mentioned before is immigrants are not a random sample of people who came from their countries. And I don't have proof of it, but my hypothesis is the further that someone has to move geographically, or the more of a different culture, language, etc., that they're willing to say, why, yes, I am going to leave behind being a surgeon in Colombia so I can work as a dry cleaner in LA to give my kids a better opportunity. I think the more of a change that move is, that immigration, that migration is, the more likely we are to be selecting um, for intelligence. I can't prove that. That's my hypothesis. So, asterisk there. Um, but I do think it would be absolutely astonishing if, as living conditions and as education improves in, you mentioned Nigeria, for example, it would be
India.
astonishing if IQ didn't increase. Like, it would disprove a lot of the theories we have in the field about where IQ comes from and how to raise it. Um, and so I do expect an increase to come as South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, as these countries have a higher standard of living. I expect their IQ inflation to increase. And two of the fastest increases I've ever seen in the literature are in rural Kenya and in China. And so, even if you have a little bit of increase happening in Europe and the US, well, if Kenya's, increasing faster, the gap inevitably has to narrow. It can't not narrow. But will it close completely? I don't know. Um, but I am willing to let these countries become wealthy and prosperous to find out. I think that would be a great thing to do.
Good of us in
I want the
America.
world to
That was
be
a great
healthy and
series of answers.
educated. What was that?
Oh, I said no. I mean, good of us in America. Like we're going to let China and the BRICS countries rise up, but I mean, they are inevitably going to do so. And I mean, that was a good series of responses. It seems to me a lot of this is very hypothetical. Like both what you and I said, we'll see in 50 years where they are in Nigeria. But my question took about 15 minutes there. So, Christy Kelly, what are you on? What's your response to that latest exchange or to anything else?
Well, a little piece that you said how to raise IQ. And so if you notice on every metric, Americans, African Americans, Blacks are at the bottom generally on the IQ test. So given that's true, if it's true, how do we raise IQ among the Black Americans?
Um, The short answer is I don't know. The long answer is we do have some hypotheses. The late James Flynn, who was a lifelong opponent of the idea that there was any genetic contribution to the IQ differences we see between white and black Americans, he took a culturalist perspective. He said, you know, uh, and he came out of the civil rights movement. In fact, he lost a job in the United States at a university for protesting in favor of civil rights. So he had some good bona fides. He saw the changes that happened in black culture from the 50s into the 21st century and said, we lifted the external barriers, and then a culture took root that didn't value education, that had an increase in fatherlessness and other things. And so James Flynn's theory was, if the culture can be, if I can, be a little simplistic, if the culture can be a little bit more East Asian, then we'll see those differences disappear. Let's get some more studies. Let's get some more work ethic. That was his hypothesis. Your question is not terribly different from a question my brother asked. He visited me when I was in graduate school. He was coming out for a job interview there in Texas, and at the time, his wife was pregnant with their oldest child. And he said, "Oh, you study all this intelligence thing. What can I do to make my baby smarter? I want to make my kid as smart as I can." And I said, "Well, you and your wife, you're both college educated. You both value education. You're not planning on leaving this family, as far as I know. You're giving your child, the best health possible. Beyond that, I really don't know." And he said, "Really, all that education? You can't even." Sorry,
It
I don't
actually
have all the
sounds like
answers.
you came up with 4 or 5 variables there. And I mean, this will be a 10-second comment. But I mean,
Well,
the things you're mentioning strike us as obvious. But I mean, when you say like
they,
you're
they
not
are
planning on
obvious.
leaving, the fatherlessness rate in the black community is 70% in terms of dad traditionally being there to provide discipline, encourage study. You mentioned nutrition. You're going to send your kid to a normal school or a prep school. You're not going to live in the hood. I mean, the issue would seem to be that a lot of people, disproportionately blacks or poor whites, do live in the hood, abandon their families, eat garbage. So, like, if you say that each of these things has a 3 or 4 point effect on IQ, like, that stuff is
Mhm.
happening. And it's something that really started in America in the 50s, at least if you're talking about fatherlessness, as I recall the data.
Well, and it becomes complex because the people who end up being in these studies of the impact of environment on IQ. Um, I would tell my students back when I was a professor. I told them crack horse don't adopt children. All these studies are
Sure.
in environments where basically your family is stable enough that you could adopt a child. So it's about the top 60 to 70% of homes. If you're meeting that minimum threshold, we really don't know what else to do. But below that threshold, we don't know, oh, the nutrition piece is 2 points, and the anxiety that comes from living in the ghetto and fear of violence, not being able to walk to the library, that's 4 points. And we can't say that because those environments are really hard to study. You can't ethically knowingly place a child there. It's the same reason why we don't know how much child abuse in the home lowers IQ, because I can't
Yeah.
place a child in an abusive environment or keep them there.
I think
So
Yeah, I think the frustrating thing is we know what to do, but it really is going to take a shift in culture. And I think this is why, Christmas, I think it was like Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, somewhere around there when they had the whole, Vivek and, debate. And he was basically saying that American culture needs to change. And I literally just logged out of X for like a week because he's right. He was right. American culture across the board, it needs to change and the emphasis needs to change. But I'll give you an example. Here in Arizona, we are dead last in education. And it's funny because before I moved out here, Mississippi was below us, and Mississippi now has jumped to like 14, and we're still last in Arizona. So, what Arizona has done, instead of fixing the problem in education, you are no longer required to take a standardized test to get into college. How is that helping these kids? It's
Mhm.
not. So I think instead of fixing the problem, fixing the cultural problem, fixing the education problem, now we're just saying, oh, it's the test. It's
Yeah.
the test is, they would say the test is white supremacist if you're talking about Black people scoring low on tests, or the test is biased if you're talking about whatever. So I was astonished when my daughter applied to college. What do you mean you don't need a letter of recommendations? What do you mean you don't need standardized tests? What is this?
Mhm. Yeah, and it is easy. And one of my colleagues has a book called Shoot the Messenger about the attack on standardized tests. I see tests as a thermometer, especially educational achievement tests, those end of year tests or those college admissions tests. It's a thermometer. How well did we do at educating this child? Now, I'm not saying that if the child does low, it's solely the school's fault. That's not true. But you know, getting rid and this has been tried 1,000 times when the whole test optional movement started about five well not started but really reached its peak about 5 years ago and everything. Let's get rid of the test. Well, one of my favorite examples is that in the 30s the Soviet Union got really embarrassed that this equalized communist education, as equal as possible across the whole Soviet Union, didn't eliminate gaps between different parts of the country, the 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 kulaks versus the bourgeois or whatever classes that they had. There were still these differences. So what the Soviets did? They just axed the test completely and pretended the problem wasn't there. And it still was there.
Mhm.
And so, you know, there are legitimate reasons to talk about the shortcomings of the test. They are not perfect. I'm a test cheerleader and I'm a test creator saying this. Um, I do not think that we should say, oh, you got a score of 1,200 on the SAT, you get to go to college and no one else does. No, there needs to be options. I taught at an open enrollment university for 10 years and loved it. Um, but these tests provide valuable information, and especially the educational tests, I think they're very good at telling us where do we need to step up our game. And you're right, southern states, it wasn't just Mississippi, but and I live in the South now, but I was in graduate school when people first started noticing the southern states creeping up a little bit in the NAEP rankings. North Carolina was one, Texas, Alabama. Um, you know, they looked at these end of year tests and said, okay, we need to step it up and we need to help all of our kids. And if that means especially helping our rural children or our African American children or whatever, let's do it. And yeah, they've crept up the rankings overall, but when you control for demographics and compare Mississippi's black children with California's black children, the those southern states are skyrocketing to the top, and it's because they have taken the data seriously and have tried reforms and things that focus on teaching and learning and not let's ignore the problem, or let's teach an ethnic studies course that California introduced to their graduation requirements. No, again, it's almost stupid when I say it, but you want to get kids better at math, teach them math and teach
So
it to them a lot and give them practice. There you go.
yeah,
There's what my PhD
Absolutely.
taught me.
yeah, the norm, if you adjust for race, and especially if you adjust for race and class income, Mississippi, I think, is number 2 in the country in education right now. So I
Oh
mean, there's
yeah.
there's probably still some black-white
Wow.
gap there. There was in Alabama when I was there as a consultant, but both groups are actually doing pretty well. The other option would be kind of the Detroit model, where you try to equalize the gap. That's your main focus, and so everybody fails. I mean, you've got like an 8, I mean, I think it was 810 for blacks, 920 for whites or something when I looked at their SATs. So, at any rate, Brooks Crenshaw, what do you think? Do you favor failure or success? Or do you want
I
to talk about
I
something?
favor success. Damn it.
Boom.
Well, so
Yeah.
you touched on something a little earlier, and this kind of ties the two previous questions together in some sense. You kind of touched on the notion of an exposure factor with regard to optimizing performance on the test, right? So,
Yeah.
and Will and I have had this conversation a couple times at the gym, and we've talked about this, and one of the questions was, if taking practice IQ tests increases your score, like, is that making you smarter, or is that optimizing your ability for the test to measure your intelligence?
Mostly the latter. And again, this is, coming back to taking a matrix reasoning test to Ghana or Nigeria. If people don't know what to do on a test, then it can't possibly measure their intelligence or, whatever you're trying to measure, their math achievement, their spelling knowledge, whatever. If people don't understand the question and how to respond, you're not measuring intelligence, you're just measuring, okay, can this person sort of grok their way through this foreign, unfamiliar situation? Which is why I'm just so incredibly skeptical about, what Will said about, national IQ averages below 70. It's like, no, clearly these people did not understand what to do on this bizarre, culturally foreign test. You do need to make sure that the person understands the question and how to respond and what they're supposed to do. And that's why when we were testing out some of the subtests for the riot, I just assumed, oh, just give it instructions. Everyone knows how to do a matrix test. And then we gave it to a sample of Americans and they didn't know.
So
And
exposing people to concepts like numeric pattern, predictive, like what number comes next,
yeah,
etc.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, and so, even giving two example items and telling them you are supposed to be looking for patterns in these pictures was enough to make Americans understand well enough to perform better on the test later. Um, and so, yes, you do need some familiarity with what to do. And if you don't have that, then the test isn't being valid for that person. Now, on the other extreme, if the person has taken that exact test before with those same items, then you are getting some inflation. You're getting what we call a practice effect,
yeah.
and you're measuring their intelligence or their math achievement or whatever, plus what they can remember from before, their experience in finding shortcuts, things like that. I mean, we all had that experience in college. You turn in the test, you walk out the room, and about 10 minutes later, oh, I got that one wrong. Dang it. Well, if you could go back and retake the test, your score is going to get higher. The very act of retaking a test, and this is true with educational tests too, not just IQ, raises a score, even if you get zero feedback whatsoever. And
So
so, yeah, you need some familiarity to know what to do. But if you have too much or it's too exact, oh, I've seen this question before, then we get an inflation.
gotcha. So there's a this is similar to the relationship between, say, meaning and language, in that even if I don't have a language, I can understand hot stove, but for you to understand that I understand hot stove, language would be helpful, something like that.
Yes, yes, very much so. And there are ways to see whether a person does understand or not. One of the simplest is just give them an example item that's really easy and see if they know how to respond. Um, and it gets complex, but yes, you do need some familiarity with the content. Give an American history test to someone in Brazil, they're not going to do as well as a child in the US. Why? If it's familiar with content, doesn't mean the Brazilian's stupid.
Yeah, and I think personally, and this is not a professional opinion, but we assume in the American upper middle class a lot more familiarity with things than a lot of people have. And that's not really so much a point about blacks or rural whites or something as it is about some of these overseas situations. I mean, like I've been in the Ribereño areas of some Latin American countries, and Brooks, you've been in far more exotic locales. And I mean, if you gave a kid in Guatemala or Afghanistan who was from the highlands a pencil, they might try to eat it. And I don't say that mockingly. Like there'd be a total lack of understanding about what you're supposed to do with every step of this. So there's almost a weird cruelty to saying, like, okay, what you're going to do is take your number two and you're going to fill in every one of these circles. I mean, people are just drawing deer on the test. So, I mean, I do think that you have to have an entire base of information to go into these things. And when you have it, it's difficult to remember that you once did not, I think.
Mm,
Like the first time I saw
definitely.
matrix logic puzzles was about eighth grade. I was an honor student, and they just looked like, excuse the language, fucking nonsense. That's a bunch of circles and pies and wheels with flowers growing out of them and so on. And then suddenly you look at three steps and you're like, oh, this is pretty easy. But I mean, you'd have to do that, and even then, a complex puzzle wouldn't be easy and so on. So not really a new point there, but just worth keeping in mind.
Definitely. And it is the test user's responsibility to ensure that there is that cultural familiarity. You said, "Oh, give a pencil to someone who's never done it." How absurd. There are anecdotes from either very early in the 20th century. There's a study about when they were given the Army Alpha to World War One recruits, and yes, it was with the pencil. One of the test administrators was interviewed years later by a historian. He said, "Yeah, some people struggle to use a pencil," and that was here in the U.S. 100 years ago, a little over 100. Um, so yeah, and it is imperative that you make sure that the person understands what to do and how to respond. That might mean you need a sign language interpreter. That might mean someone only has to point. And in some cultures, I don't have firsthand experience with them, but I have heard from colleagues and read from colleagues that the idea that children are supposed to answer questions on their own without consulting their community or their family is so incredibly foreign to them that the tests are completely useless to them. That's something to know. I mean, I don't think we see that in the US, but you take a test to that country and you say, oh, lo and behold, look how dumb all these kids are. They couldn't answer the questions. No, it's not that they couldn't. They didn't know that they were supposed to, and that's very different.
Hmm. All right. That's actually a great close point. Christy Kelly, as I understand, you are going to leave us for a professional speaking engagement. So you give the first last word of today. What's your take on IQ, the test game, the college admissions game, anything you plan to speak on?
Sure. Well, I definitely wanted to encourage you to tell us about Riot and how people can do it. I just Googled it. It looks like it's an online test, and I'm super skeptical of online tests. So make sure you say that in your closing. But in my closing, I just wanted to say I was in Mississippi, I guess it was 6 years ago, that I was last there. And when I first moved there, I looked at the education system and I was astonished at how horrible it was that I immediately just started homeschooling my kids because I moved from Redondo Beach, California, and there was no way I was moving from this upper middle class neighborhood and putting my kids in these schools where they're going to be horrible. So I homeschooled them for the period of time we were there. So I am so happy that Mississippi has turned it around and however they did it should be a model for the rest of the country. And I think a lot of it starts with that yes, ma'am, no, sir, no nonsense, this you're here to get an education. I mean, that has to be where it starts at.
Oh, beautiful. I'll actually segue onto that and pass the ball to Brooks for the last comment prior to Russell's. But yeah, I think that's true. Whether or not this fully closes IQ gaps, I mean, I think we do kind of know how to teach and train people. Human beings were the first domesticated animal. And the whole idea of you encourage fathers to raise their children and you make your child study for 2 hours after school and so on is actually you have high IQ teachers that know their subject, that don't hate their kids. Like we know all this, we're just not doing it. We should start doing it. My own expectation is we'd see the gap close by at least half, but we'd also see everyone get a lot smarter in the sense of performing well on board tests. Brooks Crenshaw, what do you think?
Yeah, so I'm really optimistic. in this conversation. Like I've really enjoyed speaking with you, Russell, and the fact that, you know, IQ can be raised, and Mississippi has made such leaps and bounds. Having worked in Kentucky, particularly in the workforce education within economic development, there's a frustration there in this state with regard to where they are. So looking at Mississippi and others as a model for how to do that is key. It's always implementation, right? Good ideas are great, but implementation is king. And how do we do that? And so I think that's always going to be the rub. But what you've added to this conversation today with regard to, you know, some of the foundational understanding of the correlation to IQ and actual intelligence is really helpful. So thanks for everything that you've done, and thanks for being on.
Oh, thank you.
And Tiger Woods agrees. Russell Warne, author of In the Know, one of the developers of the Riot, RIOT test, which you should check out if you're interested in the intellectual development of your kids. What is your last comment here, really on anything?
Yeah, my last comment is, even if we don't know, at least for people in a, you know, lower middle class to upper middle class environment in a wealthy country, even if we don't know specifically how to raise IQ, I think there's value in at least trying to get every child, every adult's cognitive abilities developed to their maximum potential. I think a smarter society is a better society. I don't know if gap A versus gap B can be closed or not. I don't think anyone knows the future, but there's no harm in trying. And so I'm an optimist, and I think that there will still be good benefits for society if we, you know, do these things that we have an idea might be helpful. You know, these Mississippi reforms, these you know, cultural changes, you know, well-trained teachers, et cetera. And I think that they're not going to hurt. So why not try?
Boom, that was beautiful. As a totally cold and amoral end note for the audience, I do think we know how to raise human intelligence. We're just not gonna do it. But the cultural stuff definitely, I think, has substantial potential. Russell Warne more than has that. He's the author of some texts that are already out that you should check out, WARNE. Thank you, Doctor, for coming on the program today. And with that, we are done with this episode of Cut the Bull. Christy Kelly, Brooks Crenshaw, for them, I'm Wilfred Reilly.
To say, Patriot J, I'm saving the day. Patriot J, I'm saving the day from you commies who lame. No, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to say. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.